Think about it this way.
And people are coming together. Excellent. I try to be on time because we have people online. So, good afternoon. I'm Kathleen Merrigan. I'm the Executive Director of the Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems at ASU. I'm a professor there. And welcome to this. This is our 5th seminar on the series, in a series on the future of food. So welcome to those of you in the room. But also we have people joining us via live stream through ASU's Global Institute of Sustainability, GEOS, on the website there, through Food Tank's Facebook page, and UNEP's TEEBAgriFood website. So welcome to everybody. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Swette Center, a few words. It is a center that's been around for about a year, and it was generously endowed by Brian and Kelly Swette. We believe that a focus on food systems, research, and education is really what's needed to transform food and agriculture consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. We have about 60 faculty affiliates covering all kinds of disciplines with a wide range of work in food systems. We're launching a BS degree in Sustainable Food Systems this fall, a graduate certificate in Food Policy and Sustainability Leadership, and in the fall of 2020, a Master's of Science degree in Sustainable Food Systems. This year, our conversations and research have focused on the power of deliciousness, organic agriculture, ag tech and food industry, global food security, and our topic today, true cost accounting. For those of you who may have attended our previous seminars, you know that we have used this format to help launch work in these areas. This seminar is the last before Suzanne Palmieri and I head to Arizona, our new home. But we will not be strangers in this town. We will be hosting 3 seminars in the next academic year here in DC. And we will continue to travel to engage in federal food and ag policy here in town. So no teary goodbyes are necessary. Before I introduce our panelists and the topic of our seminar, a quick shout out to a few key people, Roxanne Ladd, Brian Henderson, and Derek Holmes. Thank you for your support throughout the year. For my colleagues watching from Arizona, know that you have a crack team here at the DC headquarters who will help you with everything that you need and who make ASU look so good. I also want to thank our colleagues at the ASU School of the Future of Innovation of Society, where we were co-housed this year. They are doing exciting work. I want to recognize that. And it's been great to have water cooler conversations with them. So on to our topic for the day, the hidden costs of American food. With SDGs, climate change pressures, and greater awareness of the impact of diet on health, and we even have a subgroup of the Congressional Hunger Caucus that's focused on food as medicine. The idea that the price that we pay for food, whether it's in the supermarket or in the farmer's market, is not fully reflective of the cost. This seems like a timely subject. But also, as I look out at the audience today, I see some friends who have been long-time champions for people who are hungry and lack the resources for food. So I want to begin with a very important point. I don't want you to misinterpret this program or my interest in this topic as a call for more expensive food. This is certainly not the goal of true cost accounting, nor anything I think any of our panelists would advocate for. I'm keenly aware of the struggle of literally millions of people in this country, and then a greater number when you talk internationally, people who are struggling to put food on the table. In the US, the average family spends about 13% of their income on food, which is one of the lowest percentage rates in the world. But looking at averages cloaks the dire challenges faced by many Americans, some of whom pay as much as 46% of their income on food, according to our great colleagues at the Economic Research Service. We like having around town here. So we have more than 40 million people in this country on SNAP, and that's an undercount because many SNAP-eligible people do not enroll in the program to begin with. So I do not believe our food is too cheap. Over the decades, the United States has implemented many policies to help keep prices low for consumers. Despite arguments to the contrary, the U.S. doesn't have a cheap food policy. I go to some meetings and I hear advocates say we have, our food is too cheap policy. I don't know. I think in some ways we have a very expensive food policy. I think Alexander will make this point among others. So looking ahead, my hope is that as a country, the U.S. will continue to design policies to protect the livelihoods of those who produce our food, as well as to ensure that the price of food is affordable to all. So, I'm going to step off my soapbox. I could go on and on about this. I'm looking at my notes. I actually had a lot more to say. That's enough. And I want to begin by introducing our first panelists. I will introduce each of our guest speakers as I ask them to speak, and we'll start with Alexander Mueller, who I've got this beautiful bio, and I will tell you some of it, but I think of him as my boss's boss's boss. When I did my second stint at FAO, that was who he was. He was very, very high up as an assistant director general of FAO, where he was responsible for land and water, climate, and genetic resources. He was a big cheese there. Yeah, and that was not his role. He grew up in the political world in Germany, where he has had several positions: city councilor, state secretary, member of parliament, and a state secretary in the federal government. So he has a long history there. Currently, he is the study leader for TEEBAgriFood, which is how I came into this whole true cost accounting conversation. And he is managing director of TMG, Think Tank for Sustainability. So Alexander, the floor is yours. And I shall give you the clicker.
The clicker. Thanks a lot, Kathleen, for inviting me and for introducing me so very nicely. The fact that you have to report a lot on my biography means I'm getting older. Thanks a lot for making it very clear. Why do we have to talk about the true cost of food? From my perspective, food systems are one of the most complex systems in the world, and without changing and transforming our food systems, we are not going to achieve sustainability as agreed at the United Nations in the 17 Sustainability Development Goals, or Sustainable Development Goals, and we will not be able to tackle climate change. Therefore, food is in the center at international level, it's at the center at national level, and all our countries are spending a lot of money on subsidizing food production. And the question is, are we spending the money well, or are we just spending the money in a way that we are increasing problems? And that's the reason why the true cost of food is so important. If we look at the food system, we can see that food does not only exist because we have to produce it. It has an impact on human health, it has an impact on the environment, and it has a social impact. And therefore, the true cost of our food has to comprise all these four elements in...
You need more of a professor voice, I'm told, a little louder.
I can speak a lot louder.
I know you can.
So therefore, if we are analyzing the true cost of our food, we do not only have to look into the cost of production, inputs, machinery, labor, and, but we also have to look at what we call externalities. And our food can only be so cheap because we externalize a lot of the costs. Let me give you a few examples. Depending on how you calculate it, food contributes 25 to 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions being responsible for climate change. 25 to 40%. If you look at the water consumption, 2/3 of the water withdrawn from our natural cycles is for agriculture. If you look at food waste, 1 1.3 billion tons of foods are wasted every year. This is 1/3 of all food. And if you put the food waste together and you consider this being a country, food waste is the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. But this is not accounted for. Damaging the environment doesn't cost anything. On the other hand, we have to repair it, and therefore there are costs. Food systems have a huge social impact. Look at the rural communities. If you have the wrong type of agriculture, only large-scale agriculture, you will see a lot of poor rural communities. And by the way, agriculture and food production is the biggest employer in the world. 1.5 billion people are working in agriculture, mainly as smallholder farmers. The automobile industry has less than 50 million. 50 million in the automobile industry, 1.5 billion in producing food. And it is without any doubt that nutrition is the biggest health risk for people. 6 out of 10 risks for human health are coming from nutrition. And therefore, the narrow approach to look only at the production cost does not tell us the truth. Sometimes cheap food is very, very expensive because we pay 4 times for it. First, in the supermarket or on the market. Second, in repairing environmental damage. Third, the social costs. And 4, the health costs. WHO has done a study about diabetes. And of course, nutrition and food is not the only cause for diabetes, but the global annual cost of diabetes is 850 billion annually. And therefore, we wanted to look at the true cost of our food. And as Kathleen has told you, we don't want to make food more expensive. Food today is incredibly expensive, but we pay from different pockets. And therefore, we did an analysis. And the first challenge we had to face is, what is the scientific basis for analyzing the value of our food? And there, a very old story from India came to my mind, the 5 blind men and the elephant. Do you know it? 5 blind men were gathering and they were discussing how is an elephant looking like, and they haven't seen it, and therefore each person touched a different part of the elephant. And of course they couldn't agree in the end on how an elephant looks like, because everybody was touching a different type, the leg, the tail, the ear, the body, whatever. And we have to face a similar challenge in science. If we translate this old Indian story into a modern story of science, and you ask scientists, highly specialized discipline science, how is the food system look like? How does the food system look like, and what is the biggest problem? You get the following answers. The economist says the yields. We have to increase yields to feed a growing population. Yes, and he or she is right. The environmentalist says, oh my God, biodiversity. Agriculture is a main driver of destroying biodiversity, and he or she is right. If we talk about with the social scientist, and he says it's poverty, we don't have access to food, people are too poor, and he or she is right. The economist says, this is a failure of markets. If we would have perfect markets, everything would be fine. And guess what? He or she is more or less right. And the health specialist says it's malnutrition. We have obesity, we have hunger, we have all the problems. Would it be possible, like the 5 blind men, if you combine everything to get a perfect analysis of the health of the food system? It's impossible. And therefore, we created a system where we were looking at the externalities, positive and negative externalities. And we tried to do an assessment of the value of these externalities. And there you can see that intervening in a very, very complex system always creates externalities. And now I have only 1 or 2 more minutes. Let me give you an example. One of the most advanced production systems in the world is production of corn. High yields, high technology, large-scale farmers. Very cheap production, by the way. And farmers don't have a lot of income. If you look at the true cost, you have to look at what is the environmental impact. Environmental Protection Agency, some years ago, not today, made an assessment on the impact in the Gulf of Mexico. 20,000 square kilometers are dead because of the runoff from production. So we have a high environmental cost. If you look at consumption of some of the produce, high fructose corn syrup made out of sweeteners. It's one of the key ingredients in soft drinks. And we all know that soft drinks contribute to obesity. So if you factor in the health costs, the costs are very high. A lot of the corn is used as animal feed, and these concentrated animal feeding operations very often are run with the use of antibiotics. And antibiotics are responsible for antibiotic resistance. It's one of the biggest threats to human health. So if you look overall into the system, you will find out that cheap food is very often very, very expensive. And to change the system does not require to make food more expensive, but to shift expenses. Can we really afford to tackle diabetes but produce more diabetes with cheap food? Or shouldn't we shift the expenses so that farmers have a higher income, consumers can afford to buy healthy food, and we avoid the health costs? Can we really afford to not tackle climate change by changing the production of our food with lower greenhouse gas emissions instead of investing a lot of money in tackling climate change? So TEEBAgriFood looks in a comprehensive way at all the costs. It tries to provide alternative pathways to produce better food and trying to tackle the health of the planet and the health of the people together with the help of an economic analysis. It's complex, but food systems is among the most complex systems of the world, and there are no simple answers. That's what we try to do together. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and just add a bit to what Alexander has shared and just say, if you don't know about TEEBAgriFood work, go to TEEBweb, and TEEB is TEEB, TEEBweb.org. And it has been a project that's been going on for a number of years. UNEP sponsored initiative. I'm on the steering committee. And it's involved 150 scholars across 33 countries. So it's a big snowballing international movement that Alexander has taken the lead on. We're going to have some people coming late, so if you have stuff on chairs where you're not sitting, you can kind of put it under your chair so people will have a place to sit when they come in. That'd be great. Okay, my next panelist, Lauren Baker. By the way, Alexander came from Germany for this, and Lauren came from Toronto. So it's very kind. I have some traveling friends that made the effort. So Lauren is at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and I hope she tells you a little bit about that because it's a relatively new organization, a collaboration of philanthropies that not everyone here is aware of. And she's working in a variety of ways on projects and efforts to transform global food systems. She has an interesting background of a lot of different things. She led the Toronto Food Policy Council, a citizen advisory group embedded within the City of Toronto's Public Health Division, and was the founding director of Sustain Ontario, which I've certainly heard of, the Alliance for Healthy Food and Farming. She lectures in global food equity, a program at the University of Toronto, and is a research associate with Ryerson University's Center for Studies in Food Security. So, Dr. Baker, you're on. Professor voice, remember that.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you in the room and also those who are watching through the live stream. Thanks for joining us. It's really fantastic to be here to talk a little bit about why we're connected and interested to TEEB, agriculture and food in particular, and the topic of true cost accounting more broadly. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food, like Kathleen mentioned, is a strategic alliance of philanthropic foundations working together as a membership and also with partners on food systems transformation and global food systems. And so really our members came together recognizing that across their programs, which are based all over the world, funding different initiatives, touching food and agriculture in different ways, they wanted to engage in a kind of broader conversation that they couldn't engage in as individual foundations. So you will recognize many of the names of our US foundation members. We also have one member in Canada, a member in India, Brazil, and quite a few in Europe as well. So very much a global perspective around the table and quite a diverse perspective as well. So in this alliance of diverse foundations, one of the first things that we did together was develop principles for sustainable food systems. So what do we mean when we talk about sustainable food systems? And for us, these principles really guide our work. And we strongly believe that they need to be advanced as a set. So you can't sort of pick and choose across these principles, but need to address them all simultaneously. And for us, a sustainable food system is renewable, healthy, equitable, diverse, resilient, and interconnected. We work across 4 impact areas. And in each of those impact areas, we have a number of strategic priorities and initiatives. I'm going to focus on our true cost accounting work. But just to name the others, because of course they're all interrelated. Agroecology, so we have a set of initiatives related to agroecology, health and well-being, and climate as well. So one of the key things that we've done in our work on true cost accounting is invest in the development of the TEEBAgriFood and Food evaluation framework. And really through this work on true cost accounting, we aim to make visible the full costs of our food system. So like Kathleen and Alexander have both mentioned, and reveal the environmental, social, cultural, and health externalities and impacts, both positive and negative, across the food system. And then through that work and analysis, really better understand how we can affect associated policy and market change. And the TEEBAgriFood and Food is a really important conceptual framework for us, as well as an analytical tool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've used that as an alliance. One of the things that we've done is support a number of applications. So here we have an analytical framework, a conceptual framework, and really it's organized across these capitals to really understand the full impacts of food systems and the stocks and flows across food systems. And so I'll just mention 2 applications that I think are kind of relevant and add to Alexander's corn reference earlier. So one application was related to the true cost of corn in Mexico. And just briefly, I obviously can't go into those findings in detail, but that was in partnership with CONABIO, which is their national agency looking at biodiversity. And one of the key kind of outcomes of that study was really understanding the need to understand and value, as well as strengthen the process by which genetic diversity is continuously evolving in Mexico. And so CONABIO has really strengthened its support, recognizing farmers as managing the dynamic process and ongoing evolution of genetic diversity in the country as a center of origin in Mexico. So I think that's a really interesting example. There were a number of critical findings, through the kind of holistic evaluation of corn in Mexico. Another example that I wanted to mention was a study that we commissioned on maize in Malawi that looked particularly at the farm income subsidy program, which has diversified over the last few years, but it's really supports corn production, maize production, and the maize agri-food system in Malawi, in that country. And through that analysis, there was a look at the research programs and priorities and where funding flows in those research programs. And really, the majority of funding goes to maize in Malawi at the expense of dry land cereals, crops that are more appropriate to the local climate and ecology, and certainly at the expense of funding programs and work on climate change or agriculture and food security. So it's really pushing kind of a macro food security in Malawi instead of addressing some of the critical food security at a more micro level, food security needs at a more micro level. We also supported, through the McKnight Foundation, an analysis of 2 corn value chains in the Mississippi Basin, so looking at conventional and organic value chains. So just to riff on the corn example. And there are a number of other really interesting applications going on around the world through UN Environment. One of the things that we've supported over the years is a community of practice on true cost accounting, so bringing together some of the lead practitioners thinking about this work from food systems and beyond, including those from the Global South who are concerned about the relevance for this work in that context, for different communities, for farmers across different geographies. And in that work, we're really exploring metrics and methodologies, how to develop and think about this, how to develop standardized valuation factors. So there are a lot of methodological questions and challenges related to true cost accounting and kind of applying these ideas and the framework, as well as developing tools so that people interested in this holistic analysis can really have guidelines and be able to undertake a study easily. We're working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to look at how private sector can take up true cost accounting, how you can look across business applications so that you can evaluate them and compare those applications. What are the key performance indicators, et cetera. And I think that group will be really valuable in terms of also reviewing and synthesizing applications as they come out, so we can advance this work collectively. From my perspective, like both Kathleen and Alexander have mentioned, the next 2 years are really critical, and we need to better understand the links between food systems, climate, biodiversity, and health and well-being. Of course, we're advancing the agendas around the UNCCC process, the CBD, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this framework, TEEBAgriFood food, and true cost accounting in food systems is a critical tool to advance those agendas. Thanks.
Great. So if you pass this down to Joe so he's ready after I give him an incredible introduction. Dr. Joe Gallagher, who needs no introduction in this town. Also a professor. We taught together, so for the last couple of years at GW, we had a class called The Sustainable Plate. We had a lot of fun. You all know Joe, but let me give you a few notes. He is currently a senior research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He is pumping out papers and studies and commentaries like a crazy man. Before joining IFPRI, he spent 30 years at the USDA, including as chief economist from 2008 to 2014, responsible for the department's agricultural forecasts, projections. He oversaw climate, energy, and regulatory issues, and served as chairman of the board of directors of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. I could go on and earlier in his career, but I think he is a well-known man. You were younger then. And Joe, I don't know what you want to say, but I will just poke you a little here at the start. I think there's kind of an implicit critique here on economists. You're disciplined, baby. What do you have to say?
You're tough. You're tough.
Professor
I'm so
voice,
happy.
get that thing close, right?
So happy that you invited me. No, seriously, this is an interesting topic. It's not a new one for economics either, I might add. Certainly, if you go back to development of things like the GDP measures, a lot of criticism of GDP saying it was one-dimensional, that it may have measured output very well, but didn't capture externalities like environmental things. You had have had various commissions like the ones that are talked about today, talking about how to bring these other measures in. And obviously there's a lot of challenges with that, and I think some of them have been mentioned. I think measurability's difficult for some, for others not so much. I mean, we have, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. We have some notion of what crude measures for crops and livestock that we can identify, but those vary by region, they vary by species, they vary by locale. So again, it's not to say you can't do it, it's just to say is difficult, and there are costs obviously involved with doing so. There's also some notion of trade-offs with those as well, and I think that's where the difficulty lies. It's not easy to make those trade-offs. It's not easy to say, well, should you push nutrition here or push the environment or other things, but I think it is important for policymakers and others to know what the outcomes are. And I think to the degree that you can quantify those sorts of things and talk about them, I think they are useful for decision making. And again, and I think that Lauren made the point of just understanding those linkages and other things is very, very important. Yeah, I sort of bristle at the notion, or when I hear the words cheap food policy and things like that, only because I think it is kind of poorly understood. U.S., and you mentioned the ERS numbers, what used to always get me, I'd always shoot an email up to the secretary's office or the speechwriter saying, don't say that we have cheaper food than what they have in France or whatever, because those were all, the measurements aren't directly measurable. You can measure income pretty well. You can measure food expenditures maybe at home, but some countries have very good data on food expenditures at home, but not away from home. As we know here in the U.S., that's been we've seen big trends that way. And so there's a whole host of variables even within that little thing. And I dare say that a lot of the at least developed countries, the share of food in those expenditures has been declining. Why? Because just by the fact that income, food is generally what we economists like to say inelastic with respect to food. You don't change with income. When you make a lot more money, you don't buy a proportionate percentage increase in food. You may change your dietary patterns, but even there, that's really typically when you're very poor and you're moving to a little more income, then yeah, you start adding meat or other higher proteins or fruits and vegetables or things like that to your diet. So it's just to say those are, I get nervous about that when people start talking about cheap food policies. I particularly get concerned when people start talking about agricultural subsidies, particularly as one, I've spent the better part of particularly the last 5 years, but even when I was with the U.S. government, talking about how wasteful agricultural subsidies are and how they have adverse effects and how the world would be a better place if we got rid of them. But not necessarily because they distort production. I think ag policies in many countries, Europe's a great example, even the U.S., have moved away from coupled support where, a corn producer or a soybean producer may receive subsidies, but they don't have to necessarily plant corn. And I think that most economists, and I would say most economists who hate subsidies like I do, would say that the effects of these subsidies are pretty small actually on food production. That's not to say, again, that they're not wasteful and they shouldn't be, the monies could be spent a lot better elsewhere. But the other thing, even if you thought they were having a big impact, you got to remember that farm level value of food is a small portion of the retail value. So how they're affecting consumer purchases and other sorts of things is even greater. And let me just take the case that was mentioned, and that's high fructose corn syrup. Here's a pop quiz. Per capita consumption of Hfcs. How much has that increased in the last 10 years? Anyone hazard a guess? What's that? It's declined by 27%. Declined. So I'm not saying that's good or bad or anything. I'll let someone else decide that. But the fact is that high fructose corn syrup has been fairly flat in the U.S. The population has increased, but it's just saying there are a lot of other things driving these consumption and other sorts of things for these. And all that while, by the way, corn producers were receiving on average around $3.5–5 billion a year. So I don't mean to be flippant about it. It's just that I think there's a lot of things. Ag is heavily subsidized. And you got to remember that those ag programs sometimes cut both ways. We have an ethanol program that raises the price of corn. So clearly that's working against things. We have a sugar program that really raises the price of sugar, with a huge tariff. And in fact, we created an industry, Hfcs, because of high sugar tariffs. So I suspect if you were to, and on top of that, I'm just getting started.
I can tell.
On top of that, HFCS as a percent of the value of a beverage is less than 5%. So double the price of HFCS, triple it. You're going to have a very small impact on sugar beverages. That doesn't mean that's not the right thing to do. It's just to say that you got to understand those impacts. And not only that, if you were to double it or triple it, I tell you what will happen, people will go back to sugar and bottlers will start using sugar. So it has to be targeted. It also has to, these sorts of interventions have to be understood in the global, bigger context of things. And let me just, do I have anything else really interesting to say? But I think internalizing costs is a really important thing. And so we look at carbon, we look at climate, thinking of a carbon tax. I think, that's a very hard thing politically to get your arms around. I mean, look at the climate legislation that was talked about in the US. What did we do? Well, we'll hit in energy really hard. Agriculture won't touch it. We're not going to go after methane. We're not going to do anything like that. These guys will have to pay higher energy costs. But on top of that, we're going to give them all sorts of incentives to improve practices by giving a lot of subsidies. And I just think even there, you can't pass something like, it was difficult to pass at the time. I'm just saying, I think internalizing costs is the way to go. It's just very difficult even there. So even for things like nitrogen, you have to think about, okay, what does corn, I mean, yes, there's certainly a link between nitrogen and hypoxia in the Gulf, but what exactly it is and how do you meet that out in terms of a tax? So, and then lastly, it's just back to Kathleen's point that you start hitting food hard, you really are talking about a pretty regressive tax. I'm not saying that that's not a bad thing, but if, I think certain income level families can afford that sort of thing and say, okay, yeah, we're willing to pay a lot more to have those sorts of environmental benefits and other things. But for poor families, I think you have to think about what the implications are there too. And with that, let me close.
Well, let me just say, wouldn't it be cool to have USDA Secretary of Agriculture Joe Glauber?
Yeah, no, thank you. Oh, you're so kind.
Yeah. All right, so let me start with a question actually for someone in the audience. How about that? So I see Mike Young is here. And for those of you who may not know Mike Young, he was, until very recently, the head of the office, OBPA, Office of Budget and Program Analysis. OBPA, I oversaw OBPA. You can see how it just rolls off my tongue. But that's where all of USDA's budget and all the rulemaking and strategic planning is housed. And he did a marvelous job, and he was there essentially his entire career. And so I want to poke him a little because he was the acting secretary for a short while in the transition between administrations, and was there during the early part of the current administration when there was a lot of talk about our regulatory processes and how they might be reformed. And so I know there was an executive order issued early on rulemaking. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, Mike, I don't know if you feel ready to talk as freely as Dr. Glauber here, but to what extent to what extent was that disruptive or challenging for USDA operations, and how, if at all, did it change cost-benefit analysis? So for those of you who aren't familiar with U.S. rulemaking, if it's a significant rule, we do a cost-benefit analysis. NEPA comes into place, which is looking at environmental impacts. We have civil rights impact analysis. There are a lot of different analyses that make up a package that policymakers should be looking at and considering as they decide how to go forward. At least that's the way it was when I served. So any thoughts, Mike? Put you on the spot there. It's probably on, I don't know.
It's on? Okay.
You have to hold it close to your mouth, though.
Okay, all right. Yeah, okay, so as Kathleen said, yeah, I was director of OBPA for, I don't know, 5 years, 7 years, something like that. And at the end of the Obama administration, I was named to be the senior career official for transition, and that meant that I was the acting secretary for about 3 or 4 months, starting in the new administration. About 10 days after the inauguration, the president signed an executive order on rulemaking. The executive order had a couple of key requirements in it. One, that any new rule would need to have an offset essentially of 2 existing rules. So if you're going to regulate something, you're going to take 2 deregulatory actions as part of this process. And it also said you've got to offset the cost. So new rule's going to impose some new cost. That's got to be offset somehow in the system through other rules or other actions. The guidance implementing that executive order didn't come out really in final until later in the spring, April, May kind of time frame. So, you know, agencies and people were starting to figure out, well, as Kathleen said, you know, we do these other analytical efforts as part of the rulemaking process. Well, here's 2 more, you know, here's 2 more sort of hurdles that any new rulemaking has to go through, has to pass. I chose to retire about 8 months into the new administration, so my ability to talk about this in any real depth in terms of what level of disruption that's caused within the department is somewhat limited. My sense of it is, though, from folks that I've heard from over that couple years now, time period, I think they've been able to somewhat deal with those kind of hurdles. It's, you know, it's another set of discussions with OMB and within the department and all that. But my sense of it is that that hasn't been a huge impediment to regulatory actions. Now, you know, how that plays out in other departments, I think there are some rules in the USDA realm that are counted as deregulatory that allow some things to meet that threshold perhaps more easily than other departments would have. So from that standpoint, you know, again, sort of more administrative actions in the whole process. On the cost-benefit analysis side of it, the implementing guidance for the executive order sort of says that the requirements that were under the existing rulemaking executive order, 12866 from the Clinton years, sort of still remain to be the guiding principles. So I don't think that the new executive order really made significant changes to that aspect of the process. So.
Okay, thank you. So you've heard from a former Secretary of Agriculture and a future Secretary of Agriculture. I will tell you, and then I will open it up to the crowd for questions. We've gone on too long because I talk too much. But part of my plot here in True Cost Accounting is I have an interest in getting the federal rulemaking process to take a true cost accounting approach. And you might argue, if you put up all the different little pieces of analyses that we do, and if you gave NEPA more teeth, maybe you do have something that approaches what Alexander has been working on with the TEEBAgriFood. But I would like to be more explicit and deliberate about that. So that's something that we'll be working on at the Swette Center. Okay, done. Who has a question for our fine panelists? Dr. Mueller, and then Dan.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on another example. You mentioned high fructose corn syrup and diabetes, but there's actually another example, and I come at this from the health side of things and understand sort of the complexities of doing these analyses because there's so many changing factors. But in the US at least, getting rid of trans fats, which made it harder to make those really cheap foods that never spoiled because they really weren't food anymore. There's been a correlation with a decrease. There's been shown to be decreased levels of trans fat in people's blood in the U.S., but it's been associated with decreasing heart disease rates. Proving that causation is hard, but I just wonder if you could talk about that and how the complexities of making that causative relationship would play into doing these kinds of analysis.
Immediately? No. We could collect 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. We'll collect 2 or 3 questions. Thank you. Dan?
Dr. Glover, are you telling me that I can't go around saying anymore that that Americans spend less than 10% of their disposable income on food because it's not a valid statistic?
Can I answer that and not wait until we
Yes, you can answer that.
accumulate all those
Bring
questions?
that
No,
mic right close to you.
Use that number. That number's fine. What I'm saying is don't use the number for France because we don't know what that number is exactly. But the US number is pretty good. They do a good job with that, and it's around 15%. So you got to check the latest ERS numbers. But yeah, but it's still low. Good.
I'm going to call in 2 more questions, and then we'll do a second round. Elise in the back there.
Hi, Elise Golan from USDA. I have a question about where this true cost accounting is being applied in your the way you're describing it. Is it along the lines of how Joe has said, where you're internalizing these externalities and the prices that we all face would reflect these externality costs in the actual price? So then each one of us is balancing costs and benefits to come to the optimal outcome? Or are you thinking that it's at the government level, where the government would be accounting for this true cost, and then at the government level, someone would be deciding how to balance benefits and costs to come to an outcome?
Okay. And for this first round, let's end with Ann Bartuska has a question. Ann, you have a big program tomorrow, right? Do you guys have something going? Yes, we do. So I just want to call attention. Resources for the Future has a really interesting seminar. Why would I say it when you have the mic?
Actually, I don't know the full title, but it's looking at the I think it's the New Clean Energy Act.
Yeah, the switch out on the power plant,
Yep.
Obama era regulation with the new.
And the
plan.
reason I'm punting, so Ann Bartuska, Resources for the Future, my portfolio is land, water, nature, and so I'm less directly connected to that particular event tomorrow. But I actually have a question for Dr. Baker. As it turns out, I was at USGS, US Geological Survey today, where we were having a very vigorous discussion around true cost accounting, natural capital accounting, and ecosystem services. And where we were stuck is this relationship of the spatial scale of the different variables, the temporal scale, over, especially if you're going to put a value on something and try to keep it around for 50 years, how do you do that? And then lastly, the governance of it, and how do you govern something that has a federal good, perhaps a national good, versus a local, where the activity is done at the local level. So you had all of this mixing going on. And I wondered if we had no solution whatsoever, but I wondered if you had dealt with that as part of your discussions.
Okay, so why don't we start with you?
Related to Elise's.
Okay, so Sam, join in.
Okay. So my question is a little less abstract, which is, do you have an example of true cost accounting in the real world? How has it worked? Is it simply a tax? What is it? What's the best example you've seen?
Okay. So let's start with the direct question to Lauren, and then the other questions are a little bit broader, and many people may want to weigh in. Grab that mic from Joe. Yeah.
A really great question related to, how do you determine spatial scale, temporal scale, and governance in relation to a true cost accounting application. And this is actually these are the questions that we're grappling with in this working group that's being led by Oxford's Food Impact Valuation Initiative. And the people around the table, beyond ourselves, are mainly businesses associated with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So many of the leading businesses are trying to grapple with these very questions. So in terms of their own risk analysis, looking into the future, and also in terms of striving for more transparency across their value chains, how to think about their impacts, and then also how to communicate those to their shareholders, to the general public, and then also communicate those in a way that, or account for those in a way that can be comparable across companies. So some of the really difficult, like unlike kind of a carbon measurement, which is a global measurement, food systems are inherently place-based. The impacts are place-based. The impacts often occur over time, and there are all sorts of associated governance issues, like you mentioned. So in terms of coming especially to standardization or harmonization of frameworks and true cost accounting approaches and methodologies, these are really key questions. Economists, of course, have been grappling with this in terms of impact valuation and for a long time. So we're trying to kind of marry up these two conversations to, understand how we could do that. One proposal on the table is like, would you create a group of advisors and a set of valuation factors for the food system that group of advisors would sort of revisit and evaluate every couple of years. So for different users, there are really different implications around the scale and temporal issues, and for different applications. But for private sector application and for applications where you want to have consistency and comparability, it's important to kind of look at this. So thanks for the question.
Okay, Alexander, we have a couple of requests for real life applications. Go for it.
Yeah. 3 answers. I would like to contribute to the question, average spending of households for food. In my country, Germany, 15% on average. But we have a very strange development. High-income families invest a lot of money for new kitchens, advanced technologies, and then they are driving to the supermarket, buying a very cheap pizza and heating it up in the oven. So investment in kitchens is a status. Cheap food. Second, there is a clear trend that health costs are increasing globally. Not only industrialized countries, but also in developing countries. Obesity, diabetes type 2. And many of these health costs are linked to nutrition. So the question is, do we have the right nutritional habits? Do we produce the right stuff? And can we really afford to continue to subsidize food production, even if it's decoupled, when in the end it generates very, very high costs? And knowing these linkages with all difficulties, and Joe is right, it's difficult from the data, it's difficult from the impact pathways. And how could I dare to say it's not difficult when the senior economist says it's difficult? It is, but we have to know it, because all countries of the world, they have sustainable dietary guidelines, but they are completely decoupled from agricultural production. So I would like to provide a link, and I hope that TEEBAgriFood could help us providing the links in order to bring more information on the complexity of our food systems. And some of the examples are currently now work in progress. The United Nations Environment Programme has received from the European Commission a chunk of money to do an impact assessment in Tanzania, for example. What kind of food production is taking place there? What are the impacts on the environment? And what are the impacts on human health, in order to get an idea if we, the international community, are investing in the right development programs to ensure food security. And this is a real big issue. The population of Africa has now 1.5 billion people. In 2050, it will be doubled, 3 billion people. Countries like Ethiopia, in the year 2000, 80 million people, 2050, 160 million people. So there's an increasing population, and how to ensure that investment in agriculture is done in a way that the health costs do not triple. And therefore, there are different projects, work in progress in developing countries, in order to identify what kind of development projects do we have to implement in order to ensure that in the end we have healthy people and a healthy planet. It's work in progress, but it's going on, and they're facing a lot of difficulties with regard to data. But difficulty does not mean impossible, because if we don't know what is the impact and we continue to invest, later scientists will find out it was the wrong way. So let's start now to identify how should food systems look like to ensure that the climate is not increasing and that biodiversity is not decreasing and humans don't get sick from the wrong type of nutrition. So it's work in progress.
Will you pass the thing to Joe?
And there was someone
Yeah,
raising
no,
his leg
but we have a
3
couple
times.
other questions still out before I call back on Dan.
Yeah, let me just make one point, and it's something that came up. I was on for the most recent FAO SOCO report on commodities, and the feature was on climate, and so I did one of the essays for that, or one of the reports that went into the making of that overall report. Well, one of the things that came up when I was doing it, so I was looking at domestic support and how that, and looking at domestic support programs and greenhouse gas emissions. And so I thought, well, let me just look at what it would mean to internalize a carbon price into greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, FAO has all these nice lookup tables where you can say, okay, cattle production in China, cattle production in the U.S., cattle production, and they'll give you a greenhouse gas equivalent of for every ton of meat produced, here's the ton of greenhouse gas emissions. And just assuming a global price of carbon of, say, $20 or whatever, you get these weird distributional impacts. Mm-hmm. I mean, not surprising distributional impacts, but beef cattle are a great example. You know, if you've ever been around a ruminant, they're pretty smelly. I mean, they're emitting belches all the time. And so a lot of methane going out that end, methane going out the other end as well, but the bigger end is actually the mouth. And what do you know? The U.S., if you look at confined operations for cattle, those are actually much more efficient in greenhouse gas emissions, per unit of meat produced. Why? Because we end up slaughtering beef cattle a lot earlier so herds are much larger if you're going to a place like Mali or wherever, and so they tend to be very inefficient. But so if you're thinking in a trade context, if you were to internalize that, then what that means is that all of a sudden you're pricing out a lot of lower cost producers, currently who are lower cost producers, may get priced out because of that thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it's just those are distributional aspects that people don't think about sometimes when you're talking about these, let alone the fact that you think the world could ever agree on what coefficients were if they knew they were actually going to be setting a price according to it. I'll rest.
All right, I will say a couple things. I was really worried about the trans fat ban and how it might affect red Twizzlers, which is my favorite junk food, but seems how we've survived. I don't know if anyone else has. Mike, your question on trans fat's a good one. I just not my area of expertise. But I do want to talk about the work that we've done with TEEBAgriFood since I've been on Alexander's steering committee for 3 years. And what we saw, our work, if I may say so, what we were trying to do is develop a common framework approach for scholars to use and doing research, understanding what that framework is, and do that kind of agreement and test studies of that framework, the methodology, we could argue for true cost accounting as a way of assessing the choices that we need to make as a society, whether you're policymakers, whether you're at the helm of a big company, whether you're an NGO and you're trying to figure out what the most important policy agendas are for your organization. So it's the precursor to real action, but we're trying to get the approach, the lens wider so that we really set up better choices. Will policymakers, for example, make the better choices? I don't know. It depends. But certainly we want them to have a sense of the full impact of those choices, and then we can maybe hold them more accountable for the choices they do make. So I think that was in our heads in terms of the work that's been done to date, and there are a series of studies that we are using to help us shape this framework that are on the website for TEEBAgriFood, that teebweb.org.
I mean, the only thing I would add to the trans fat issue is I think there's a fascinating literature and a fascinating bunch of experiments going on right now on soda taxes. Mm-hmm. So you can look at another thing where you're trying to hit some behavior and say, okay, look, we don't think it's so great that you're consuming a lot of this. So how do you structure those taxes? You know, are they narrowly structured? Do you do it again? As an economist, I view this hitting it at the retail level is where you should do it. So taxes, I think, are appropriate here, as opposed to saying let's go after some production element or something like that, or you know, so a ban at the retail level, or and not advocating that necessarily, but again, the interesting thing there is you can see a lot of what that's meant in the various localities that have done it. In Mexico is probably one of the more interesting ones because they actually have it's comprehensive. It's a large tax. It's not, you know, just the 5 cents or whatever we're looking at, and I think we're still waiting. We'll probably have better data, at least on what the health impacts of all that are. But some interesting work in any event.
Lauren, you've been wanting to get in on something.
Well, I wanted to pick up on the health question because I think it's a really good one, and I also wanted to broaden out the question because I think this is actually what this framework helps us to do, is it pushes us to kind of have a broader perspective every time. And in the conversation today, we've been talking a lot about health in terms of nutrition, but we commissioned a report on the health impacts of food systems. I think it was really interesting. Which identified, 5 channels of health impacts. And I think its contribution was actually seeing these impacts as interrelated. So impacts around occupational hazards, it's very dangerous to work in agriculture and food and the food industry, around environmental contamination, which we've talked about, and then the contamination of food, all the associated food safety issues, especially in the global south, as well as food insecurity and unhealthy diets, which we've talked about. So, when you take those costs as a whole, and when they're not considered in decision making around food systems, whether either at the policy level, or the connections aren't made there, or at the kind of farm level, or at the enterprise level, it's really a problem. So I think one of the contributions of this framework is to push us to widen out the framing constantly. The other kind of central message in that was around using the precautionary principle, which our European colleagues are kind of much better at doing. So not always needing the causal link, but to take a precautionary approach and keep health promotion and prevention in mind. So,
okay, I know there are other questions, but I also know we're at time. It's a beautiful early evening here in DC, and we have a reception, an opportunity to discuss this in greater depth. So thank you very much. To those of you online, thanks for joining us. Thank my panel.
Thank you.